right, so let's go ahead and get started today. This is the Idaho Home Garden Tips, and our topic today is native plants with Dr. Steve Love. He's our horticulture specialist here, Extension Horticulture Specialist in the state of Idaho. Always glad to have Steve help us with some of these topics. So go ahead, Steve, if you want to share your screen or however you want to do that.
Ron asked me to talk about native plants and landscaping particularly landscaping with native plants. And what I chose to do with this is approach it from the standpoint that maybe we really can't landscape from the very beginning, as you would with a new property. And instead that we might have to kind of work with our existing landscape and knowing that typically we don't want to completely take out a landscape and start over. And in that kind of a situation, then how do we incorporate native plants in a way that makes sense and that allows us to take care of them properly? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So why would we want to include native plants in the landscape? For me, the most important aspect is that we can create a very unique kind of beauty in a landscape. And if you choose the right plants, you can have an amazingly attractive garden. And I've got about half of my property now converted to native plants. I have about an acre. And the places where I have the native plants are the most beautiful parts of my yard. And slowly the native plants are creeping into the rest of my yard. I don't know whether they will ever completely take over because I do have some things in my traditional part of my landscape that I probably will not get rid of. But for example, I have some berms right up in front of my house that I kind of typically had in junipers and some other things that are kind of normal landscape plants. And last year I took them out and planted some wild buckwheats in there, and it's a lot prettier now than it was before. So you can create very, very unique and very beautiful gardens. Also, another reason is to reduce water use. Most of the native plants that we have that come from our part of the world, and when I say our part of the world, meaning the Intermountain West, unless they're riparian, they're almost always to some degree drought tolerant. And because of that, we can use less water and still keep them attractive. Another is to preserve natural heritage. So often we create landscapes that are filled with exotic plants that might come from Europe or eastern part of the United States or somewhere else, China. That's not really our heritage. Our heritage is plants that grow here. And also we can create wildlife habitat, and often birds and small mammals especially rely on specific plants, and if we put those in our yard, we will attract them. We also attract things like snakes and other things that you may not want, but I kind of like them because they take care of the voles. And anyway, also attract and support pollinators, and then avoid the introduction of invasive species by just simply not planting them so they don't get away, and move into areas where they aren't maintained but may reduce the natural habitat. And then finally, you can, if you use the right plants, you can reduce your maintenance costs. And that's just simply because you're not doing, you may not need any fertilizer or very little fertilizer. You may not need the kind of care that uses a lot of money and resources. It doesn't mean you won't have to take care of them, and it doesn't mean they don't need to be maintained. If you want a landscape, even if it's a native landscape, you have to have good care. So I always talk to people who are building landscapes, and often they approach me and ask how they can develop more of a native type landscape. And they say, I just built a new house. I've got free reign to do whatever I want. And I always, that just makes my mouth water. I just go, oh man, if ever in my life I could have a new house with a completely bare landscape that's just waiting for me to do something with it. And but in my lifetime, I probably will never see that situation. And most of us will never see that situation. We buy a house with an established landscape, often older homes with very old landscapes. And then we kind of live with whatever somebody else put in 30 or 40 years ago. And so when you have that kind of a situation, how can you make native plants work and provide some of the benefits that we were just talking about on this last slide? And that's how I'm going to approach this presentation, is talk about some ideas, some ways that you can bring native plants into a landscape without having to completely raise it and start over. So again, most of us, our reality is that we have what we have, and mostly we're filling in the holes with extra plants that we bring in. Of course, some of us are a little, we fill in the holes maybe even more than we should. If we're ever around plants, we have to have some, and we'll find a place for them. But in reality, it's probably better to have kind of some idea of a strategy to keep your landscape so that it doesn't become just a wild place in the neighborhood. So we talked about these reasons, but two of the critical reasons to add native plants is to conserve water and to create habitat for pollinators. And we're hearing a lot more about pollinators and pollinator issues. And we're hearing more and more about conserving water. I went to a meeting that included a lot of city managers and people who were responsible for managing the public properties within those cities. And most of them said the same thing. They said, right now we have enough water, but we're reaching the point where we're above 90% of what's allowed for our city to use. And if ever we have a little bit of a drought, basically our flexibility is disappearing. And we're going to have some significant water conservation efforts in the future in order to avoid some serious problems. And those are people in cities all around us: Idaho Falls, Pocatello, Burley. They were us. Okay, and so it's going to become more and more of a problem. And then we're a little bit familiar with pollinators. Pollinators are struggling, and we're not just talking about the honeybees, but the native pollinators, the butterflies, the little pollinator flies, the ground nesting bees. Some of them very, very specific pollinators on very specific types of plants. And if we don't have the right plants in our habitats, then those insects can't live, and those pollinators can't live. And so it's important that we think about them, and it's important that we create habitat to replace the habitat that we take away every time we build another house or build another building for business. Whatever reason, whenever we make progress, if you will, within our cities and other places that we live, we often are damaging things for a lot of the animals that were here a long time before we were. I just threw this in just because it's interesting and fun, but I've known of cases where people got damaged from having fights over water rights. It's something that is critical to our livelihood. It's critical to our living spaces, and it's something that we often are willing to fight for if we need to. But again, this kind of just illustrates the point that we're going to have to be more careful with what water that we have, because we won't have more ever. We may have less, but we will never have more. And how you landscape really dictates how what your water use will look like. In our climate, about 70% of the water used in a home is used for irrigation on the outside of the home. And if we don't irrigate, we can't maintain landscapes. Even if you have a drought tolerant landscape, you need a little bit of water, but you need a lot less water than you would if you have a more traditional landscape. For example, this information came from the Jordan Valley Conservancy District, and they have some gardens where they actually measure and test some of this to generate some of this kind of information. And what they found is that in an average home garden in the Intermountain West, you use about between 40 and 50 inches of irrigation water to maintain your landscape. Whereas if you put what we call a modified traditional landscape, where you use water conserving plants, drought tolerant plants, you can create basically the same look, do the same things, have a landscape that looks such that most people couldn't tell the difference. You can almost reduce that water use by half. And if you create a dry woodland, you get clear down to below 10 inches of irrigation needed. And if you go a high desert, which basically means you're not irrigating at all, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend in our climate, because these plants that are really drought tolerant don't die if they don't get water, but they go dormant and they don't look very good for a landscape without any water at all. And I've got parts of my landscape that I only irrigate between 3 and 5 times a year. And again, these are the native plant elements of my landscape, and with just 3 to 5 irrigations, about 1.5 inches of water each time, and they look good all year long. And so you can landscape so that you use a lot less water. Pollinators again. So here's this cartoon. One monarch butterfly says to the other, "And how are the kids? Growing like crazy. We go through 2 gallons of milkweed a day." And there is such concern about pollinators, and monarch butterflies are one of the species that is really, really endangered right now. Especially there are 2 different groups of monarch butterflies. One group comes out of the Midwest and the eastern United States and flies to overwinter, migrates to overwinter in Mexico. And then we have a western group of monarch butterflies that come from the Intermountain West and the West Coast, and they fly to California and overwinter. And the reduction in the number of monarch butterflies now that are going to California has been reduced by over 99% over the last 10 to 15 years. And we don't know all the reasons for that. We don't know exactly what's happening, but we know that we better start paying attention to it, or we'll lose monarchs altogether in this part of the country. And the Midwestern and Eastern butterflies are suffering too, not quite to that degree, but there is reductions. And you look at this picture, there are all kinds of pollinators, and some of these pollinators need very specific plants, and they will only visit very small groups of species or genera of plants, and they've evolved with the plants that are native. And so if you don't have those native pollinators or those native plants, you don't have these specialist pollinators. And so it's very important that we give them the habitat they need to survive, and they will find you. I've got my research plots in the Aberdeen area, and we're a long way from undisturbed wildlands. We're in the middle of potato fields, and we put in all these native plants to evaluate them for landscape purposes, and it's amazing the kind of pollinators that we've attracted into that spot. We don't know where they came from. I actually have a lot of researchers and graduate students that from a number of universities that come onto my plots quite often to observe and try to catch some of the pollinators that are there. And we didn't do anything to attract them except to give them the plants that they prefer. Okay, so now that covers reasons for doing this. How do we do this now? How do we incorporate native plants in an existing landscape? And these are the things I'm going to cover, and I'm going to get as deep into this as I can. And so here's the things that I'm going to try to illustrate. The principle of adding trees and shrubs to open areas. If we have a place where it isn't already completely shaded and we don't have a tree or a shrub in a place that could have one, well, we can add. We can insert some dry shade plants under the existing shade that we do have. We can convert a dry corner or edge into a shrub or perennial garden, especially if it's in a place where we have a difficult time maintaining it with traditional plants anyway and keeping it beautiful. We can turn a grass slope into a rock garden. We can beautify a difficult planter strip or health strip. We can create a naturalized meadow area if you have some land that you're not using for other purposes. You can create a pollinator garden just specifically to try to support the pollinator species. And then finally, you can develop part of your landscape that is especially attractive to birds and small mammals. Okay, so let's start into these strategies and just get a feel for what we can possibly do with an existing landscape. So here you've got a picture in the center of a house, and they've got lots of grass, but not very many trees yet. Perfect opportunity to fill it in with some of the native species that we have. We can either use coniferous or deciduous trees or shrubs. We can plant those that are relatively drought tolerant if possible, or if we're fitting it into a more traditional landscape, there are those native species that can thrive quite well in more heavily irrigated space. And then we choose the species that fits the space, that in its mature size will contribute to the beauty of the landscape and not just create confusion and problems. Now, I'm going to go into some descriptions of some species, and I don't want to try to give you all of the information for every species that I'm going to discuss. And so I developed a key, and so when I throw up a slide, I've got some pictures of the species, and then here's some information that will be included. For example, if it's a local native, there's a target, a bullseye. It's close. It's plants that are within the area of southern Idaho or places very close to that. If there's a little mountain symbol, that means it's a regional native. It's found somewhere in the Intermountain West. For its water use, the M is modified traditional. In other words, it might be a little more drought tolerant, but it mostly needs a fair amount of irrigation, or it might be dry woodland, or it might be xeric. And you see the symbols that go with those. And then finally, what about its sun requirements? Full sun, part shade, or shade. And then you have a sun there, half a sun, or a cloud to indicate those. So I'm not going to tell you this information about each one of these species. That means you probably won't be able to, in the time the slide's up, be able to fill all the information in, but you can go back and study that more thoroughly if you'd like. Okay, so one of the species that we can use is in a landscape, if we're trying to fill in, is a Rocky Mountain juniper, the Juniper scopulorum. And there's just the kind of field run type Rocky Mountain junipers that don't really have a name. And there's also a lot of cultivars like Tolescence weeping or Skyrocket that have very unique characteristics. They're still native. Somebody just found a very unique form of it and brought that into cultivation, and have propagated it usually by cuttings since that time. And it's quite drought tolerant. And so if you're trying to create more drought tolerance within your landscape, it's a good plant. The water birch, Betula occidentalis, and there's some really nice forms of this. It's a very pretty, attractive tree, almost shrubby in its form. It'll develop a lot of branches from the base if you allow it to grow that way, or you can train it to a single trunk if you'd like. It usually grows closer to water, but I found this plant to be quite drought tolerant. I have it planted in a place that we only water about 4 or 5 times a year, and it does remarkably well there. Pinyon pine, another evergreen type that has 2 species, Pinus edulis and Pinus monophylla, the single leaf pinyon. The single leaf pinyon, for the most part, is probably a more attractive tree. That's the one just above the title, and on the left, and the other one is Pinus edulis, which is more common, and the one that's found all over around the canyonlands of Utah and down into Arizona and so forth. Pretty tree, and actually does better if your property is just a little bit on the dry side. Limber pine also likes it a little bit drier than a traditional landscape, but not much. It can grow in a traditional landscape as long as you don't really overwater it. Doesn't grow really huge, and so it's another evergreen that's a really nice tree and has a number of cultivated forms of it. The Vanderwolf, Extra Blue. There's some other cultivars, but there's also just seed grown kind of field run type plants as well. Okay, so that's just a few. That we have a lot of others. We have a lot of evergreen type trees that come native. The deciduous trees, not as many, and that's because when you have drought tolerant, the deciduous trees just don't seem to be able to survive quite as well or adapt quite as well to drier conditions. But there's a lot of books, a lot of information. I actually sent you some information that I think Lena was going to post in the chat, and so you can gather up those resources and look more for the kind of species that you might want to plant. Okay, now another strategy then, fill in under the trees with some shade plants. And if you already have trees, then here's some things that you might want to look at to add under those and create some kind of interesting environments underneath it, especially since if you have trees that are providing quite a bit of shade, often the grass and some of the other plants that we often plant under them may not be as healthy anyway. So find some things that can be healthy under those conditions. So use plants that grow as an understory in their native habitat, and you can use a number of species of shrubs and ground covers. You can use plants that are tolerant of full sun if they will withstand some part shade, or you can use plants that are typically under part shade conditions or even fairly heavy shade conditions. And you want plants that are competitive under this reduced or moderate light situation that you might find in your yard. And here's some plants that will do that fairly well. One is mountain maple, very pretty little tree that grows. You can either have it grow as a shrub again or as a small tree. Has a number of forms. I've got one that turns kind of a really pretty intense orange color in the fall, which is very, very attractive. Golden currant, often you'll find it growing in full sun, but just as well, the birds sometimes will bring the seeds in because we have a lot of golden currant that's native out in our desert areas. And sometimes birds will eat the berries and bring the seeds in, and they'll drop them in underneath a big tree, and the seedling will come up, and they do quite well under those conditions. And so it's one you can fill in a shady area with. Oregon grape actually does better under shade. It actually is not completely winter hardy here if it's out in the full sun, and it will grow in the full sun, but the leaves get damaged by dry conditions in winter sun. So they get sunburn, and it damages the the leaves. Whereas if you put it in a place where it's in the shade, at least in afternoon shade, quite often it will maintain its health and look prettier. There are two species, Mahonia aquifolium, which can get taller. Sometimes they can even get 6 or 7 feet tall. And then Mahonia repens, which usually stays under a foot tall. River mallow, you often find this plant stuck up under the poplars and other things that grow along some of our streams, and it can do quite well in the shade. Iliumna rivularis grows about 3 to 4 feet tall. Very beautiful plant. I've got some in bloom in my plots right now. Very, very lovely plant in a landscape. Columbines, they'll grow in full sun, but they also grow in part shade and can fill in a shady spot. You wouldn't want to put them in some place where they have deep shade all day, but as long as there's some speckled light and maybe even an hour or two of sunlight, they'll do quite well. And then rock clematis,
a number of
question. Yes, go ahead.
So this has actually come up in a few presentations in the past, and while you were talking about these, it kind of reminded me of that. We've had a lot of people ask about shade plants that will grow underneath conifers, like underneath your spruce trees or pine trees, you know, where the grass won't grow. And I was just wondering, since a lot of those pine and spruce trees are native to the Intermountain West, will some of these native plants grow under those?
There are some things that will grow. I'm not sure I've covered things in this particular case that'll grow under conifers. And the problem you have with conifers isn't so much, a lot of people think that, well, they drop a lot of needles that makes the soil acidic and then the plants won't grow. It kind of poisons the soil. They really don't do that, especially not in our calcareous soils. But the shade for them is deep and heavy, and it's 365 days a year. And so you just don't have enough light for a lot of plants to compete and grow under those conditions. And so, you know, if you want to get right up against the trunk underneath a big old dense blue spruce or something, and try to plant something, you know, good luck. There's some things will do a little better than others, but you know, you're better off to move the plants out just a little bit away from right under the tree and allow them to get just a little bit of sunlight. But it's just, even if you have dense shade in a deciduous tree, often in the spring when the plants underneath them start to grow, they don't have leaves. And so there's a period of time where they can do their stuff. And with conifers, you just don't get that situation. Okay, rock clematis, and there's this is Clematis columbiana, but there's also Hirsutissima and Fremontii and some other shrubby clematises that do pretty well in the shade and are very, very attractive plants. Bellflower, Campanula rotundifolia. I've got some, I can see them out my window right now. Boy, are they pretty. Got them planted up around all my roses, and that's where one of the native plants invaded my more traditional landscape space. But they can withstand full sun, but they also do quite well under some partial shade. Heucheras, a lot of the heucheras you can find them out in full sun again, but they do pretty well with especially some fairly significant afternoon shade. And I've got a spot on the west side of my house where I have some Rocky Mountain junipers planted in a windbreak, and there's not too much space between those junipers and my house. And so it gets pretty shady back on that side of my property. And I've got my grandson digging and tilling and getting that space ready, and I'm going to fill it up with heucheras. And I think they will do very, very well. Geraniums. This one's Piney Woods geraniums, Geranium cespitosum. We've also got Viscosissimum and a few other native geraniums that are very, very beautiful. And often you find them growing down under willow bushes and under the trees that are not too far from streams and so on. And so it's a plant that is pretty drought tolerant, but can also withstand some more normal irrigation conditions and withstand a lot of shade. The checker mallows, this is white checker bloom, Sidalcia candida. There's also some others that are native to the Intermountain West and native to Idaho. And a lot of them are pink, but very pretty, and most of them can grow quite well in under dry shade conditions. And there's some penstemons that grow actually pretty good. We consider penstemons often to be full sun xeric type plants, but there are some species that grow quite well under both moist and shady conditions. This Whipple's penstemon is one of them. In the wild, you often find it down growing in the lodgepole pine and some of the other plants that are common in our area. And then we got a series of native ferns. This is the western sword fern, and some of these ferns can I have one of the western sword fern. I have one of those on the back of my house that basically gets no full sun ever, and it's very, very happy there. So these are some that can withstand pretty deep shade. And this is one of the things that you might be able to get to grow under those conifers, not just this species, but a number of species. And the male fern, Dryopteris felix moss, is another one. And there's quite a few of our native ferns that make very nice landscape plants. Okay, new strategy. How about we convert a dry corner or edge of our property into a shrub and perennial garden? We've all got those spaces that are just difficult to manage. And this picture that's on the lower right has got some native plants and has got some not native plants in that planting, but it's one that is perfect for showing the possibilities of what it could look like. And you could create it as all native, or you could create it as partially native. But you can plant some drought tolerant things there, and then you don't have to worry quite as much that you get that corner watered quite as well as maybe you try to do with your grass to keep it from starting to brown on the edges. And so consequently, you can create something take something that's difficult and turn it into something that's very beautiful. So depending on the space that you might have in a corner, you might plant small trees. I've got a fragrant ash tree that I have growing in my garden, and I'm starting to plant some around in other different places that only gets about 12 feet tall. Beautiful, would be beautiful for a little corner garden like this. You can plant shrubs if you got the space, and you can plant a lot of wildflowers. You could create it as a full sun garden, or you can go back to some of the things that we just talked about with dry shade gardens and incorporate some of those plants and some of those ideas. And you will want plants that can survive fairly dry conditions, not unirrigated, but fairly dry with respect to comparisons with the rest of your yard. And you want plants that remain attractive under drought conditions and won't just dry up and look tough and unkempt. Here's some things that will grow there. Bristlecone pine. I've got some bristlecone pine out in my garden, part of my garden that I only water 4 or 5 times a year. It's getting a little tall now, and we talk about it as being a very small plant, but it'll eventually get 25, 30 feet tall. Mine's up to probably 10 or 12 feet, but it's taken it 15 years probably to get there. And have the typical conical form that we tend to see in our conifers. But again, drought tolerant. And by this year, by the way, my son was out poking around in my garden, and he came back in and he said, "Hey, there's a duck nesting underneath your bristlecone pine." And we checked on it once in a while, but we tried not to bother it. I went out there today and the eggs are all uncovered and all hatched out, and the babies are all gone. I don't know where they went. I got quite a hike to water from my house, but they went somewhere. Anyway, it was kind of fun. 9-bark, Physocarpus capitatus is our Pacific 9-bark. Physocarpus malvaceus is a more southerly species and a little bit more rhizomatous and difficult to manage, but both can be quite beautiful under the right conditions. And the little heads of flowers that you see there on the right hand side, that's what mine look like that I've got growing in at the research station right now. They're in full bloom and they're just beautiful. Very nice plants. Mountain spray or rock spray, Holodiscus discolor. There's also a native Holodiscus dumosus, which is also doesn't have quite as long and showy of flowers, but very pretty and a little more drought tolerant. Oak leaf sumac, the Rus trilobata. It comes in a lot of forms. These are actually pictures from my plots. The one on the top left is a form that I found down near Malad that has extremely intense red fall color. It's absolutely beautiful and very shiny leaves. And the one on the bottom actually has a weeping form, and it's a very pretty shrub, but more orangey in the fall and kind of hairy, fuzzy leaves instead of the glossy leaves. But it comes in a lot of forms, and some of them, most of them, are very attractive for landscaping. Syringa, this is our state flower. Philadelphus lewisii. There's just those that are just taken in wild form, like the picture, the main picture on the left there, and then there's actually some cultivars that have been selected in different places throughout the West. One's called Blizzard, one's called Cheyenne. Those are the two that I could find, and they're fairly easy to find in the trade. Beard tongues or penstemons. This is a genus of about 280 species, and all are very attractive, and a lot of different colors and forms and shapes and sizes. And I've got one rock garden mound that is totally dedicated to penstemons, and I've probably got about 50 species in there. They're just amazing, and a lot of them are, the earlier ones are in full bloom right now. And I don't have to put a hummingbird feeder at my house because I have lots of red penstemons, and man, do they attract hummingbirds like crazy. And they're mean. They get real defensive about penstemon flowers. Owl's claws. This is another one that has invaded parts of my yard that was more traditional bedding plants previously. It's another one that I interspersed with my roses that grow along my driveway, and right now they're in full bloom and they're just amazing. And they provide earlier color than the roses, and then the roses come in and you get this yellow with a lot of reds and oranges, reds and yellows that I have in my roses, mostly reds, and it really sets them off, and it's really attractive. Okay, Colorado aster. This is Aster coloradoensis. It's just a short little plant. It grows about 8 inches tall. It's in full bloom in my rock garden right now, and great little plant, and comes from very tough environments. It grows in places where you wouldn't think anything could grow, but it also adapts quite well to a more cultivated, more friendly environment, and looks very pretty. Desert 4 o'clock. This is one that you should plant only if you have enough space. That plant you're looking at right there on the top left is in front of an extension office in Blackfoot, and that plant is about 10 feet across, and it'll die completely back. All of the foliage will disappear. It just kind of disintegrates and crushes up and blows away. And then the next year it grows up from a huge root crown, and you get a whole bunch of stems that come up in the same spot, in a diameter of about 5 inches or so. And then, a month later, it's 10 feet across again. But a beautiful, beautiful plant if you got room for it. Sundrops, Callilophus cerulatus. This is in the evening primrose family. This is one that actually doesn't open just at night. It opens during the day. But there's a lot of different species of the Anothera and Callilophus of the evening primrose group that are just wonderful native plants. And they're often very, very supportive of specialist pollinators. And paintbrush, if you can get paintbrush started. Paintbrush is a little different in that it's a parasite, and so it doesn't grow all by itself. You have to grow it with something else. So if you want to plant it in your yard, you usually need it growing in a pot with something else. And you kind of choose what that might be, or you could choose what that might be, especially if you grow out your own. But paintbrushes are great. Just that it's nothing else provides the color that paintbrushes do. But once you can get it in your garden, it'll usually stay there, and it'll move around a little and seed itself in other places. Sunset hyssop is another. And there's a whole group of hyssops, Agastaches. This one's rupestris, and it's a late bloomer. It begins to bloom in July, and then blooms pretty much until frost, which gives you a season of pollinator support and a beauty that's often hard to feel. Buckwheats are the absolute best for providing species specific or specialist pollinators. The flowers, one of those clumps at the top of one of those plants probably has 1,000 flowers in it, and they're little tiny things, and so consequently they attract very unique pollinator species. And you can get some amazing little insects that come and visit these. And sometimes you can walk up to them and bend over to look at them and disturb the pollinators. And it's just like the whole plant lifts up and leaves. That so many pollinators are on it. They're tremendous plants, and they're very, very underutilized. The buckwheats are, and I think we need to use more of them. And there's a lot of species. I've got about 50 or 60 species myself that are very, very nice plants. Hey, Michaud's wormwood, aren't missed yet. It's related to sagebrush, but it's herbaceous, and it only grows about 10 inches tall or so, and just beautiful emerald green foliage that's very, very attractive. I've got some of these underneath my bay windows in the front of my yard. I really, really like them. Giant saccatone. This is a big grass. It grows about 7 feet tall and is just feathery and light and beautiful. And it'll create a very, very nice specimen situation where you can really set it off by putting it in the right place with the right other plants. An Indian grass, a little, not quite as tall, about half the size, but still a fairly prominent grass, but very, very interesting golden colored inflorescences that are very, very pretty. Okay, but just recognize that I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg with the species possibilities. I'm giving you some of my favorites and some things that I think might work in specific situations, but they are by far and away not the only things that you could do. So here's another strategy. If you have just an odd place that's kind of steep slope that you're trying to maintain grass or some other foliage on that just doesn't work very well, just turn it into a rock garden and maybe terrace it so that you have some small flat places to plant. And you can do some really interesting things. And in a rock garden, you usually use small statured plants so that they don't overwhelm each other. And you can use a lot of different kinds of plants in a rock garden and make it look very, very, very nice. But usually we're talking about using wildflowers and grasses. And then it should complement the rock garden itself should complement the other hardscape in your yard. In other words, not look out of place. It should have the appropriate form, texture, materials that make it look like it kind of fits in. And then pick some nice smaller plants for it. Penstemons are great in rock gardens, and there's a bunch of species. On the top is pine leaf penstemon. On the bottom left is Hall's penstemon. On the bottom right, cordroot or mountain penstemon, which grows up in our central Idaho mountains. Very, very unique form of it grows there that's very, very beautiful. It's in full bloom in my yard right now. Great, great plant. Cutleaf daisy. I've got it in my yard too. It's just finishing up its bloom. It's been blooming for about 6 weeks already. It'll take a little rest, and then it'll throw up some more blooms in a little bit. Very, very pretty plants, and some of them are white and some of them are more of a light kind of purplish blue color. Hooker's Townsend daisy, just a tiny little cushion plant. That plant in the top left is only probably 8 inches wide and maybe 4 or 5 inches tall at the most. And then they bloom really, really early. And then they're done blooming, but the plant doesn't go away, and the plant doesn't look bad. It maintains its kind of form and texture and continues to contribute to the landscape. Old Man's Whiskers, GM triflorum. The ones I'm growing are at about the stage on the right-hand side where they have the feathery tops on them. Very interesting nodding blooms when they're actually in full bloom, but another really nice plant, and it can take a considerable amount of water, and it can also grow quite well in some partial shade. Phloxes, there's a bunch of phloxes. Phlox keltii only grows in a few small isolated areas. One of them is at the headwaters of Birch Creek up north of Idaho Falls. That's a very, very unique environment, actually. It has a lot of really interesting plants. But that Phlox keltii, a lemhi purple, actually was taken from that area and made into a marketable plant. But we've got pink, we've got white, we've got all kinds of different colors that come in that Phlox keltii. And you've also got Phlox douglasii with some cultivars like Iceberg and Red Admiral. And there's a bunch of others too, Ostrom montana, Aculeata. There's a whole bunch of species of very, very nice and beautiful phloxes. Pussy toes are great little rock garden plants. This one's Antenaria media. It only grows about, when it's in full flower, about 2 inches tall, but gets very, very dense mats that are really pretty whether they're blooming or not. And there's a lot of different species and a lot of different forms of the pussy toes that are great, great landscape plants. Another different buckwheat, this one's oval leaf. I found this red form on Sheep Mountain, which is just west of Arco. There's pink forms, there's white forms, there's yellow forms, but all very, very attractive, very pretty plants. And blue fescues really set off a rock garden. They're small enough to be included and contribute a different texture and a different color, but still look good. And again, rock garden plants. There's the North American Rock Garden Society. There's a whole society dedicated to finding plants and growing things in rock gardens. And so there's a lot of sources of ideas on how to do that. Okay, how about beautifying a roadside health strip? They're tough to mow, they're tough to irrigate, they're tough to keep looking good. Bill bugs just tear lawns up in health strips because of the heat element that's there. They're tough to keep looking good. So why not converting them into something wherein you're growing things that actually like it there, and create something that's beautiful, like you would see in the bottom right picture there. I think the bottom right is a little more beautiful than the top picture is, and I think we can create some very, very nice situations. Now, in some of these health strips, these planters, roadside planting strips, we sometimes already have trees established, and you might need to use strategies that we talked about with the dry shade, and use a little bit different plant palette. But often they're kind of like what you see here. There's full sun and you can put a lot of different things in them. The plants I'm going to show you are plants that are more full sun. But using an entire palette of drought tolerant plants so that you don't have to water it very much in this situation, that's one of the things you want to accomplish, especially since when you water those spaces, often you're watering the road and the sidewalk more than you're watering the plants, and that's not very wise use of water. But you can use trees, you can use shrubs, you can use wildflowers. You can combine both beauty and toughness in these situations, but plant things that like it dry, like it hot, and create something very, very attractive. One thing you might use, curl leaf mountain mahogany. I've got one of these growing in my rock garden, at the edge of my rock garden in my native plant area of my yard. Beautiful, beautiful plant. They're evergreen, which makes them really, really interesting in that they're broadleaf, not conifers. But and they get these wild looking corkscrew seeds. You can see that in the left-hand picture there. Desert fern bush, very tough. It grows out on the lava rocks. If you go out to Hell's half-acre rest area and stop and walk out, you'll see a lot of them growing out there. They can grow where it's tough and hot. And so they're very adapted to that kind of a situation. Dwarf lead plant. Mine are in full bloom right now, and man, are they beautiful. They're putting on an amazing show. But this is another tough plant. Can take a lot of abuse and produce something that's very attractive. Big purple sage, or you can use Salvia dorii, which is Door's sage. Two different species. The Door's sage is actually a little more drought, or a little more winter hardy, but this one, it does pretty good in most cases, and it does better where there's a little, or just a little afternoon shade, because it doesn't seem to really get burned down in the wintertime if it's under those conditions. I've actually got one growing under my limber pine, and it's doing very, very well here in my yard. Very attractive, wonderful pollinator plant, and can withstand very, very tough conditions. Lacy buckwheat, Eriogonum corymbosum. You often see this plant growing down in the canyon lands, the red canyon areas of Utah, and it grows other places too. But it likes it tough. It likes tough, dry conditions. And dwarf yucca, yucca nana. I've got 3 plants on my research plots right now, and between the 3 of them, I think they have about 7 flowering stalks that have shot up this year. And man, are they beautiful. And they're so attractive even when they don't flower. Just amazingly compact, wonderful plants. And I've got one in my yard too that's doing very, very well. Rocky Mountain penstemon is, and a bunch of the penstemons, the red ones, the blue ones, any of the penstemons that are dry land species would probably do well in a hell strip. Frosted mint, another one that grows, comes up from central Utah. And again, a very tough plant and a wonderful pollinator supporter. And tufted evening primrose, this is one that blooms mostly at night, but flowers open early enough to see in the day, and they're still open in the morning. Then they turn pink and they're gone, but it produces new buds every day. So every day it has a new set of flowers on it. And that picture's in my rock garden. Tall fleabane, got 2 of those growing right out here in front of my window. I can see them out here. Wonderful plant. With very, very fuzzy, interesting flower buds, and then very, very attractive blooms. And desert zinnia is one that I plant where it's really tough. In fact, I plant it sometimes where people walk on it, and it just does fine. It doesn't care. But it's a little bit rhizomatous, not so much that it's invasive and hard to deal with, but it will kind of fill in an area and spread out a little bit. And in a health strip, that might be a very marked advantage. Sundancer daisy, Hymenopsis acaulis. This comes in a lot of forms. You see one on the left with very tall flower stalks, one on the right where the flowers are sitting right on the foliage, and they come in all sizes in between and different sizes of flowers, but all of them are very, very attractive, and all of them bloom for a very extended period of time, often up to 4, sometimes even 5 months of bloom, which is pretty unique with perennials of any kind, whether they're exotic or native. And little blue stem, and there's a number of other grasses too that would grow very well under these conditions, but it's a very, very attractive grass. There's one that's actually a cultivar called the Blues, which has very interesting reddish blue color to it. But there's a lot of forms of it that are very attractive. I got just a couple of other little short strategies that I want to discuss. And one is to create a naturalized meadow if you've got the area for it, where you can just plant things and kind of just let it go. There's always a risk with that, in that you might have things move in that are hard to manage and that you don't really want there. But I've got a little piece of my property that I've done that with, and I really like the results of it. And so you can do that. Plant grasses and wildflowers that are both competitive with each other and that need minimal care, and that can seed off and spread themselves around a little so they can keep it renewed. And you want short, moderately competitive grasses. You don't want some of the real tall grasses because they will crowd other things out. And you want the tall, competitive wildflowers. And I found the greatest success with plants that are in the daisy family. And here's some suggestions. One, big bluegrass. This one doesn't. It's clump grass. It's not rhizomatous, and so it doesn't crowd everything else out. And it's not so big that it causes any issues with the other plants. Idaho fescue is also another one that grows very well under those conditions and is small enough that it doesn't outcompete. Tufted hairgrass, if you have a little wetter meadow area that you're going to water quite a bit, or at least water some, because it won't grow where there's no water at all. Another one that grows very well and remains clump forming and attractive. But here's some of the plants that I really have found success with. Blanket flower gaillardias do very, very well in a naturalized meadow. Mexican hat also does, and it spreads itself around, and it'll come up and grow in places and then disappear and then come up and grow somewhere else. But very, very attractive. So a few penstemons compete under those conditions. Venus penstemon is one of them. Comes from the Hells Canyon area. Great penstemon for that kind of application. Blue flax will grow with almost anything, and it just seems to be able to even if it's crowded, to just maintain itself and keep coming along. And long bloom period. The blooms will open in the morning. You'll have blue, and then all the blue disappears in the afternoon. All the petals fall off, and a new set of buds come overnight, and they open blue again, and they'll do that for 2 or 3, sometimes even longer months during the summer. Okay, and then plant a pollinator garden. And here you want to just pick things that are very floriferous and that have different bloom periods, so something's always in bloom. And you can use shrubs, you can use wildflowers, use appropriate flower structure, make it pretty so that it has attractive flower color, and include plants that attract specialized pollinators. Like, for example, in some of the ones I've talked about are like buckwheats and things that bring very, very unusual pollinators. And again, extended flowering is very, very important. Some of the things you might include, if your pollinator garden is dry, rubber rabbit brush is great. One of the reasons is because it often blooms in late August through into October, a period of time when pollinators have very, very little else to go to. Cinquefoil has a very, very long bloom period. It'll bloom all summer. The Dasyphora potentilla, there's a number of names for it, but it comes in yellow, comes in white, comes in pinks and oranges and things. Some of those are not native. They come from Europe, but they're all very, very closely related. Most of our native ones are yellow. And buckwheats, here's a Blue Mountain buckwheat, Eriogonum strictum, great pollinator plant, long bloom period, blooms when a lot of other things are starting to wane. And again, buckwheats are just very, very important for a lot of these little specialist pollinators. Hummingbird mint, another Agastachy canna, great plant for pollinators in a long bloom period and a late bloom period. And that becomes important. If you've ever seen a perennial garden, you know, sometimes you get into August and September and there's not much blooming there. And this is one of the plants that will help resolve that. Fire chalice has, again, a very, very long bloom period, and some forms of it bloom late as well. And so again, that provides that window of opportunity for pollinators that often isn't filled. And blue sage is another late bloomer, and a very, very pretty, very interesting blue color. And it's usually in full bloom when we get our first frosts in the fall. And yarrow, great pollinator plant. If you can put up with the invasiveness of it, it will spread itself around. It's rhizomatous, and you got to be able to deal with it or plant it in a place where you don't care. And this pink form, I've actually now selected deep, deep red forms of it that came from this pink form, which are very, very beautiful plants. And again, attract a wide, wide range of pollinators. And another cinquefoil, red cinquefoil. This is an herbaceous one, Potentilla thurberi. Most of our cinquefoils or potentillas are yellow, and this is a very unique one. We call it our Christmas plant. And purple coneflower, anything in the daisy family and the sunflower family are great pollinator plants. And then this is aromatic aster, is another one that I love because of its late bloom. Sometimes it's still blooming when everything else is actually frozen down. And I always wonder how it sets seed under those conditions, because flowers are usually very prone to frost, but it always sets good seed. It's an interesting plant. And butterfly milkweed, a lot of good milkweeds, but this one is less rhizomatous and has much, much showier flowers than most of our other milkweeds. Great garden plant and great in a pollinator garden. And purple prairie clover, Dahlia purpurea. There's actually a number of dahlia species. And again, these can tend to attract a lot of specialist pollinators. They're actually a Fabaceae. They're in the bean family, pea family. And bee balm, and there's a number of things in the mint family that are great for pollinator plants. Okay, and then develop habitat for small birds and mammals. And I'm going to go through these really, really quickly, because mostly what you want to do is provide shelter and food. And the plants that we put in should do that for the animals, especially the birds, but also the small mammals. Red twig dogwood produces berries. Great for cover. I actually use this as a hedge around my house. Serviceberry, great berries, and it's also a good early pollinator plant. And smooth sumac, great cover, also produces a berry. A little bit invasive, so be careful where you put it. It will spread out and keep growing suckers all over, but if you got the place for it, it's a great plant. Black hawthorn, Crataegus douglasii, same kind of thing as a serviceberry, very similar benefits for a lot of the animals. And then snowberry, again, you got berries after very, very interesting small flowers that appear. Okay, reading resources on the web. One thing you might want to access is Landscaping with Native Plants. This is a publication that I wrote along with a number of my colleagues, specifically for our area, and give you more ideas on plants. And it also has some references on where you can buy a lot of these plants. And then there's a number of good books, but Water-Wise Plants for Intermountain Landscapes by Wendy Mee and the group down at Utah State University is a great book that you can easily access and has a lot of good information in it. One of the things that I will say just to finish up, you can buy native plants as mail order. We've got some good nurseries that sometimes just carry a few native plants, but sometimes specialize in them. There's a little nursery that we work with a lot down in Twin Falls called Native Roots, and they specialize in Intermountain West native plants and have some great products, and are worth a visit sometime. But they do not mail order. You'd have to make a trip there. But also, if you want, sometimes you can grow these things from seed, and you can get seed from native seed companies that specialize in selling native seed seeds of native plants. Native plant societies like the Idaho Native Plant Society, they have sales and things. The American Penstemon Society has a seed exchange where people send in seed, and then you can get access to that seed. And then researchers, people like me, can sometimes share some things. But remember that sometimes our native seeds aren't just as easy as just planting them like we do some of our annual flowers. Often they require some things like cold treatments. We call that stratification, or some kind of scratching of the seed, or damaging it, or boiling it, or doing something to help it break a hard seed coat. So there's some things that you have to do, and there's lots of information on the web on how to treat different types of seed. And so if you get something and you want to grow it, take the time to do a little research, figure out just exactly what will make it grow the best, and then you'll have a chance of having some success. So with that, we take care of our world. There is no planet B.
Dr. Love has spent a lot of time out collecting and developing native plants that have a little bit more flowering capability. And so that's one of the reasons we asked him, because he's done a lot of that and really familiar with plants that can do well in our landscapes. So,
and we've got a little garden that Lena takes care of at the Bonneville County office, the extension office there, that you're welcome to go and look and kind of see what some of the potential is.
Yeah, we did dedicate one of our planter beds to native plants. How's that turning out, Lena? Seemed like there were a couple of plants that didn't succeed.
We had 2 varieties that didn't make it this winter, but my goodness, the other ones have come up great. We've got, at least 6 or 7 varieties already in bloom, and it's just full of color, and it surprised me. It looks great.
And sometimes when we think native plants, we think wild, woolly, unkempt, weedy, gray, dormant in summer. And they can be all of those things, but they don't have to be. There's some great and amazing native plants.
If you've got weeds in your flower bed, you'll still have weeds in your flower beds. You'll still need to take care of the knot weeds and the dandelions and the south thistles and all those other things that kind of come in. But we can still get a lot of beauty out of the native plants. So, okay, well, looks like there aren't any more questions. So, Dr. Love, we appreciate you spending some time with us and helping us. See you all in a couple weeks.